The fourth wave of the coronavirus in Israel seems to have nearly passed, with the government rolling back restrictions Sunday. Despite this, a 16-year-old boy died tragically Saturday from post-coronavirus syndrome, the first fatality from such a condition in Israel since the pandemic began. Let's take a look at the report.
16-year-old Aiden Jamal from Jaljulia died on Saturday from post-coronavirus syndrome, the Schneider Children's Medical Center announced. The teen, who was not vaccinated, suffered from pediatric inflammatory multisystem syndrome, known as PIMS for short. It's a rare condition that may develop in some children after exposure to the coronavirus. As such, he was transferred to the Children's Hospital nearly 2 weeks ago, and as his condition deteriorated, was connected to a heart-lung ECMO machine. Since the pandemic began, there have been over 100 cases of the syndrome discovered in Israel, though Jamal's death marks the first such fatality. Yet, despite the tragic loss, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced that as of Sunday, a pilot program to put an end to mass quarantines at schools in green communities would take effect. The program, called the Green Classroom, entails that pupils in a class in which a verified case is found will undergo PCR tests to be carried out at IDF Home Front Command testing sites, or HMOs. The pupils will remain in quarantine until negative test results are received, and then afterwards will return to regular studies in class, but will continue taking rapid tests with antigen kits for 7 days. On the 7th day, an additional PCR test will be carried out, and when negative test results are received, the entire class will return to routine. Currently, though, the plan only applies to elementary school children, and should 4 children from the same class test positive, the entire class will have to enter quarantine regardless. Additionally, the exemption from quarantine only applies to school hours. After school, children will still have to remain at home and in quarantine. The plan is set to gradually be applied in 127 green communities. And also on Sunday, some 350,000 students finally getting back to classes on campus for the first day of the new semester at Israeli universities. And according to the Council for Higher Education, this marks a 4% increase compared to the last academic year. And so, with only 1,023 new coronavirus cases diagnosed on Saturday and the reproduction rate, or R, down to 0.71, life seems to be returning back to normal in Israel, with students back in school and the government easing additional restrictions, hoping that there won't be a 5th wave on the horizon.
As Israel celebrates the waning of the 4th wave of the coronavirus, its problems in the medical arena are far from over. As last week, some 2,500 young doctors and interns handed in their letters of resignation over the government's failure to pass legislation to shorten 26-hour work shifts. And joining us now to discuss this is medical student Jonathan Alk. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you are part of the organization Milsham, which is helping and consulting the doctors through this. Now, why did they hand in their letters of resignation? I mean, this is a very drastic move.
Indeed, but a drastic move is because of a drastic deterioration of the original plan. People have to understand that originally there was a plan conceived by Milsham, by the interns, the residents, and the health ministry, calculating all the costs and all the manpower required, which actually was supposed to induce the shortening of shifts from 26 hours currently to 18 hours on 25 to 30% of medical residents around the country, including internal medicine wards, the corona fighters, all the corona departments, the ICUs, the ER, and with the surgical departments in the periphery moving forward to the center of Israel. And a night, actually, before the discussion in the health committee by MK Idit Silman, the health ministry suddenly changed their position. Now it's only 10%, leaving out all the internal medicine wards, leaving out the ERs and everyone, almost everyone out. And also the surgical departments are suddenly removed from the new plan, and they may discuss it in 5 years if to add them or not, which led us to do that exact move of resignations.
I mean, it's just a drop in the bucket, obviously 10%. I mean, what are you asking for now, essentially, to go back to the original plan, 25 to 30%?
Exactly. The plan was already agreed on, the plan that guarantees that by the end of 2026, every medical resident in Israel will work no longer than 16-hour shifts plus 2 hours of shift transfer to either the morning staff or the department that you did your shift in. And we don't understand why we were forced to go down that road, because we were pretty sure that we're going to get a fair plan that will help every medical resident, that will help our patients And all of a sudden, the health ministry wants to induce another committee and think about it a little longer when everything was already agreed upon. And we were blindsided in the Knesset.
Now, Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz going on television saying that even so, 10% is major progress after 10 years of essentially no legislation passing. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are that indeed it's the first time that a move like that was accomplished by a health minister, but I don't see that as an accomplishment. Actually, I think that the health minister is forgetting every time he says what he says on TV to mention that some of the residents might not even get a real shortening of their shifts because that new plan leaves out some of them with all what ifs and little letters in the new plan. So I think that maybe he should be more upfront that this new plan is not good, that this new plan is harming both to residents and to patients in 90% of the cases that you will need medical attention.
Now, Health Minister Horowitz also saying that 25 to 30% is unrealistic because there is currently such a shortage of doctors. And with the coronavirus pandemic and, let's say, flu season on the way, he says it's just not realistic. So what do you have to say to that?
First of all, I think the health ministry thought it's very realistic when they calculated everything and agreed upon the budget and the manpower. I also want to remind that during the pandemic, 500 manpower personnel staff were added, and those spots were filled immediately. So, and also there are people who finish med school, finish their internship, and are waiting to start residency. They're waiting at home with no job. So I think there are enough doctors. It just requires the money. Now, 2.5 billion shekels of health budget and only 60 million per year, for adding staff and personnel. I think maybe the financial calculations were a little off, and I think that if they'll do it again, they'll see that what we already agreed upon is not only doable, but is much more fair and better for the system.
Now, I'd like to talk for a moment about the doctors themselves. I mean, can you share with us some of the conditions that they're under? I mean, 26-hour shifts seem, unthinkable in a way.
It is unthinkable, and many people that I talked with in the street don't believe that it's actually the situation, but it is. I think physiologically, it's important to understand that the human mind is not able to sustain so many hours of awakeness, and damage is done both to the doctors and to the patients. I mean, in Israel, there are actually regulations that prevent bus drivers, truck drivers, cab drivers from driving and working more than 12 hours because, and I quote, they are a danger to those around them. So in Israel, we have kind of an absurd thing that you're too dangerous when you're driving long hours on the road, but you're not dangerous to anyone when you're holding a scalpel or calculating dosages or making life-saving or life-threatening decisions because you're so tired.
All right, Jonathan Alk, we're out of time, but thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this important issue.
Thank you for having me.
Continuing on the same topic, joining us now to discuss the impact of the strike on Israel's health system is Professoradav Davidovich, Director of the School of Public Health at Ben-Gurion University. Welcome.
Hello.
So over 2,500 doctors handed in their letters of resignation last week. It's been a couple of days now. How has this impacted hospitals and patient care so far?
So far, actually, it's only about resigning. It's mainly a move to put pressure. The resignation is going to enter into effect in the coming 2 weeks or more. I'm almost positive that the labor court will also intervene, but I think that we need to see the long term. This problem is already with us for more than a decade. The conditions of working in hospitals, not the salaries I'm talking now about, but all the, the support that is needed, actually finally got many of these young and exceptional professionals to get into the situation that are signing resignation letters. You can just imagine, the psychological effect. I think that on the other hand, maybe we have finally an option to resolve what has been for more than a decade, very harsh conditions. Now with COVID, it just served as a mirror to show us how these conditions are creating a trauma on the personal level, on the family level. I really hope that all those who are taking part in these negotiations of course, first of all, the Israeli Medical Association, but also a Ministry of Health, Ministry of Finance. All of them will sit together because we have finally the option to solve on the long term the situation and not giving just a Band-Aid like we did for so many years.
And so what needs to happen now, essentially?
I think they need a strong process of mediation because it's quite clear that it should be a gradual process. We cannot just move to a shorter night shift, just from one day to the other. The process needs to be gradual, and I think the main controversy now is it just going to be 10% and moving ahead, or maybe we can be more flexible. I just must say that there cannot be just one solution for everybody. We must have each sector. It's one thing about surgical specialties. It's a different thing, internal medicine or ICU. And I think each one of them deserves its own process. Like, for example, the public health physician. I'm a public health physician. For example, we don't have overnight shifts, but because of that, we have other problems. And this is why it's very hard for us to get new people coming to our internship. So we need very, very fine and sophisticated solutions that are going to be finally for the best of all of us, for patients especially, but also for these young professionals and things that happened several decades ago. And my father is an anesthesiologist. I remember as a child I was working, but this is something we cannot continue. I think everybody understands now. It's just a question of how gradual we're going to do it. We're going to start with the periphery. I'm from Ben-Gurion University. I think it's a good move, but I think there's a middle ground that can be found in the solution that will be for the long term.
All right, great. Professoradav Davidovich, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
Germany's outgoing Chancellor Angela Merkel arrived in Israel for her final official visit after 16 years in office.
Aber es bleibt ein Glücksfall der Geschichte, dass es gelungen ist, nach der Shoah zwischen Deutschland und Israel solche Beziehungen aufzubauen. Und deshalb wird das Thema der Sicherheit Israels auch immer ein zentrales Thema für jede deutsche Regierung bleiben.
And so joining us now to reflect on the Israel-Germany relationship under Merkel and discuss the future of relations under a new government is Joel Shalit, editor-in-chief of The Battleground and a journalist of European Union Affairs. Welcome.
Pleased to be on your show.
So we've seen a very warm reception for Angela Merkel. Bennett saying the relationship between the two countries has never been stronger as it was during her term. What are your thoughts on this?
It's been a very, very controlled relationship on the German part, because on the one hand, there have been profound policy disagreements with Netanyahu during his time in office. And on the other hand, there's been a profound expression of German commitment to Israel per se, whether it's with the JCPOA agreement with Iran or with military cooperation with Israel in various fields, both industrial and in terms of aid, military aid from Germany to Israel.
Now, in her time in office, I mean, you mentioned that there were some major policy disagreements. What were some of perhaps the highlights that you could tell us about?
There was always, Angela Merkel was always really upset about the lack of progress on the Palestinian front and about the achievement of a two-state solution. The peace process was stalled for most of her time in office, and she blamed the Netanyahu government for that. And one might remember her former foreign minister, Sigmar Gabriel, being extremely outspoken on that issue, particularly when he came to visit Israel a number of years ago. So, and it's been a thorn in the German-Israeli side for the nearly the entirety of her time in office. She was much closer with Ehud Olmert, for example, before Netanyahu. But nonetheless, Merkel went the extra mile to support Israel, to provide Israel with economic and military assistance, and to increase what they call intergovernmental consultations, as they say in German, between Berlin and Jerusalem, with now 13 years of meetings between the two governments. Today's visit for Merkel is a mini consultation, not a major one, such as the consultations which have transpired since 2008 prior to this.
Now, looking forward, what can we expect in terms of the Israel-Germany relationship now? What can you tell us about the new government? Merkel said that security would always be a central policy issue for Germany. What can you tell us looking forward?
One of Merkel's singular achievements in office was to create a uniform German foreign policy towards Israel that transcends the particular party that may be in office in any given time. If you talk to German politicians today, whether they be from the CDU, or the SPD, the Greens, or even the AfD, there is a fundamental commitment on both the right and the left to maintaining a very strong military and economic relationship with Israel, one which it, for historical reasons, obviously will always favor Israel. This SPD government will essentially, or the one that we envision coming in with the Greens and the FDP as is being currently mooted, will essentially continue many of the same policies that Merkel has had in place for Israel during her time in office. There will be no substantial difference whatsoever. The SPD was very outspoken about Israel during the 11 days war in May, and this will remain constant, assuming the SPD takes the chancellorship in the next few weeks.
All right, well, let's hope that Germany and Israel continue warm relations. Joel Shalit, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Nice to be with you all.
And more on the diplomatic front. Foreign Minister Yair Lapid will travel to Washington, D.C. next week to meet with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the United Arab Emirates Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the U.S. State Department announced on Saturday. According to the State Department, Blinken will sit down with both foreign ministers separately and will then hold a trilateral meeting. The officials are set to discuss progress made since the signing of the Abraham Accords last year, future opportunities for collaboration, and bilateral issues including regional security and stability. And of course, Iran is expected to be at the top of the agenda as nuclear talks have so far been stalled for several months. Both sides have hinted at the talks resuming shortly. The last time Lapid and Blinken held face-to-face meetings was in June in Rome, Italy. At the time, Lapid told the U.S. Secretary of State that Israel had some serious reservations about the Iran nuclear deal, but said the best way forward was to discuss the disagreements privately through direct and professional conversations and not in public press conferences. And in related news, Iran has enriched more than 120 kilograms of 20% enriched uranium, according to a statement made by the Iran Atomic Energy Organization chief on Saturday, edging them closer to achieving nuclear capabilities. So what does this announcement mean for the stalled nuclear talks and for Iran's race towards a nuclear bomb? Joining us to discuss is political science professor Gerald Steinberg from Bar-Ilan University. Welcome.
Thank you.
So let's talk for a second about what this announcement actually means. I mean, just last month, the country reportedly had only 84 kilos of enriched uranium, still above what it's allowed to have under the previous nuclear agreement. And now they've jumped even more significantly. I mean, how close are they to achieving nuclear capabilities?
I think we have to look at all these announcements with some degree of skepticism. They may be correct. They may be deliberately designed to mislead and to put pressure on the Americans to reach a negotiation quickly. I think the Americans probably are aware of the fact that that's part of the Iranian strategy. If they, in fact, have 120 kilograms of this highly enriched uranium, that certainly puts them much closer to being able to have a weapons capability. On the other hand, they've been shown to exaggerate a lot of their military claims, sometimes announcing weapons which really don't exist at all, sometimes enhancing the capabilities far beyond what they really are. So I think we have to be careful. We don't know what is being said in the intelligence circles, what information is available. We don't know what, and they may themselves, the people who do follow this very closely, based on very high-level intelligence, may not also know. So in some degree, we're guessing in the dark here. The Iranians want to make it seem like they're very close to or have reached a fait accompli, so therefore there's really no sense in putting pressure on them to slow or stop their program, and it's certainly not in the interest of the United States or Israel or anybody else outside of Iran to go along with that if, in fact, there's a great deal of exaggeration, as I think there is.
And so we should take this with a grain of salt, you're saying, but what does this mean for the nuclear deal? I mean, talks have been stalled for quite some time. Does Iran want to go back to the negotiating table? I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
Iran wants to be able to have its cake and eat it too. That's always been the case. They want to continue to develop nuclear weapons. They want to become a regional superpower. They want to be able to move their forces around the region, including attacking Israel with a high degree of impunity. I think that in many ways they don't realize how much that's going to threaten their own existence, but we'll put that aside. So this is part of an ongoing game. At the same time, they want to end the sanctions. They want to get a lot of money, which they claim is owed to them out of the United States and the international community. So they're playing this very tightly held deck of cards. It's a game, really, game of poker, perhaps. I'm not sure it's chess, but perhaps more like poker with a lot of betting, a lot of taking of risks. It sounds like the Americans are not buying into it. Certainly, Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, sounds quite skeptical that the Iranians are serious about reaching any kind of agreement, which would at all put limits on their nuclear capabilities. We'll have to see what's going on behind the scenes. And to the degree that the Iranians are desperate, if they really want to end the sanctions and have some sort of economic framework that they can use to make their internal political and social systems more functional and less threatening to them, to their own internal capabilities and governance, then they may at the last minute fold and agree to some terms that might be acceptable. But right now, what we're seeing are these kinds of grand claims. Hey, we're very close to having nuclear weapons. We're doing this even though there's been all these attacks on our capabilities, the assassination of one of our top leaders of the nuclear program, buildings that blow up that carry a lot of the nuclear facilities. They want to say they're moving forward. And frankly, from the outside, it's impossible to tell whether this is accurate or just a lot of hot air.
And yet the United States still hoping to resume talks.
Well, the Biden administration has gone in, taken office, hoping, asking, trying to pick up the pieces that were there after the end of the Obama period and which Trump pulled out of. But the Iranians, frankly, were not, in any case, they were not holding to the agreements, the terms that were promised. They're cheating in a number of different ways. And so that was a game also of chicken. It's continuing now. But I think it is part of the American foreign policy under the Biden administration to at least declare that they want to have an agreement. But they've also, I think there's been a very clear turn towards skepticism by Mr. Blinken, even by Biden himself in the last few weeks. So the Americans have said that if it doesn't reach an agreement soon, they will then, there are other alternatives on the table, leaving that for the Iranians to figure out what they're being talking about. And we're still we're seeing efforts to reach an agreement, but I would remain highly skeptical that that's going to succeed.
All right, Professor Gerald Steinberg, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you very much.
And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Winter is just around the corner, but still clear skies and warm temperatures tomorrow. Lows tonight in the upper teens and lower 20s, highs expecting to range in the upper 20s and lower 30s tomorrow. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. What we're seeing is a ceremony of paratroopers singing Mi Meshuga, which means who is crazy. All right, well, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.23 shekels to the American dollar and 2.59 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Ladar Gavelazi. Be well, and thank you so much for watching.